James A. Garfield made his home in Menor in 1876. His 1880 presidential campaign was run from his front porch. The press often camped out on the property and soon dubbed the compound Lawnfield. Following his assassination in 1881, his wife Lucretia returned to Menor to create the country's first presidential memorial library. She spent the warm months of the year at Lawnfield until her death in 1918. The house remained in the Garfield family until 1936, when the president's children donated it to the Western Reserve Historical Society. Congress authorized the property as a National Historic Site in 1980. The Garfield family continued to make political and economic contributions to Menor's development. James Rudolph Garfield followed his father's footsteps into state and federal government. His grandson Bob, formerly known as Rudolph Hills Garfield, spoke to us about his family and his life in Menor.
I'm junior, actually. My father was Rudolph Hills Garfield, and they were both maiden names of his two grandmothers.
Jim also grew up in Menor and still resides near Lawnfield.
My real name is James Rudolph Garfield II.
And you were named?
After my grandfather, who was affectionately known as Bum.
What was it like growing up in Menor in the 30s and 40s?
Oh, it was a wonderful place to grow up. It really was. There were, 24 or 500 souls in what was the village then. Of course, geographically it was smaller. Menor Avenue was a brick road.
It was very simple. It was very simple. Today you can't cross the sidewalk without getting hit.
The trains used to go by down below there, the old steam trains. They even stopped in Menor occasionally. They certainly stopped when they got to Painesville.
Yeah, well, the old Interurban used to go right by our house at 1093 Menor Avenue. Streetcar, I tell people that, they always say, "You're older than I thought you were." I said, it wasn't that long ago.
We were very, very fortunate because the family had 100 acres here, and my Uncle John Newell had another 90 acres next to this. And you knew everybody who lived in the town, which was a pretty good scheme because they knew you, and you could only get away with so much. But we tried to push the edge of the envelope and succeeded sometimes. So this was really country, right in the middle of town. And as I say, here we are in this barn, and my buddies and I lived in the barns and climbing the trees and fishing in the Newell Pond, and it was an ideal place to be, really, for us.
Your great-grandfather was the President of the United States. Your grandfather was Secretary of the Interior. Your mom, the first woman mayor of Menor. How difficult was it being a member of such a prominent family?
Well, it wasn't difficult. It's not like we were subject to being kidnapped or something like that.
No.
But it was a family, and it was a great family.
You know, what other people do in your family, especially those that preceded you, you're proud of them and everything else, but you don't use it. To me, it's ridiculous. Go around saying I'm the great-grandson of the 20th President of the United States. So, I had nothing to do with it, but I'm very proud of it.
One of the most memorable parts of our family was knowing so many generations of them.
The President and Lucretia Garfield raised 5 children: Harry, James R., Molly, Irvin, and Abram. Daughter Eliza and son Edward died at early ages. Tell us about your grandfather, James R. Garfield.
I'm going to refer to him as Bum because that's what he was always known as by his grandchildren.
And why was he called Bum?
Well, Jimmy's sister Janet was the first of the grandchildren born. And he said, well, I'm just going to be known as grandfather. That's what we'll do. Won't be any of these silly things. And of course, he'd bounce on his knee and say, bum, bum, bumpity bum. And then she picked that up, and it was that forever. and he loved it. He wouldn't have had it any other way. But it was a shift in gears from the more formidable approach of grandfather.
Right.
He had a great sense of humor, he really did. He had a twinkle in his eye, but boy, he was stern.
The second son of the president graduated from Williams College. Admitted to the Ohio bar, he practiced law in Cleveland. He married Helen Newell in 1890 and was elected to the Ohio Senate a few years later.
Then, when Theodore Roosevelt became president, he was asked to go down to Washington to be what they called Commissioner of Corporations. His principal activities in Washington during those early years there was in the trust busting. Later in his time in Washington, during the Roosevelt administration, he was made Secretary of the Interior, which was a cabinet position then. He was involved with the Indian affairs and also some of the relations with Mexico, because there had been border disputes and that sort of thing. Actually, his law office for many years had a Mexico office. And he used to go down to Mexico. He had a partner or two down there. And he'd go down there and be involved with those things.
President Roosevelt said that Garfield's administration of the Interior Department was the best he'd ever had.
Garfield is a great comfort to me. He has such poise and sanity. He is so fearless and yet possesses such common sense that he is a real support to me.
Bum and Granny were really great. Granny unfortunately met an early death from an accident up in the east. But Bum was the salt of the earth.
Bum was an amazing man. He really was. Kind of quiet, didn't say much loud, never heard a loud word out of him, no matter what happened or how we screwed up.
And after he got to sleep, we'd crawl out the back way and push his car out of the drive and go for a drive. And one morning at breakfast he said, "Yeah, I can't understand it. I had 28 more miles on my car this morning when I went to work than I had when I put it to bed."
Locally, he was instrumental in reestablishing the Menor Library, which is why the Garfield Library is named after your grandfather. Your Uncle Abram was also involved.
He was the architect for the old library building, which was down on Center Street and Menor Avenue, and then was later moved to become Don Krieger's insurance business office. It's still on Center Street North. That was the library as a kid.
We hereby dedicate this meeting room as the James R. Garfield Community Room.
James R. Garfield served as the first president of the Menor Village Library Board. His objective was to revive the public library. By 1903, enough money had been raised to construct a permanent building housing over 2,400 books.
Mr. Garfield stated, and I quote, "One of the best and easiest methods of education is through the library, that we reach all classes, all ages, and all kinds of people."
Frances Cleveland was appointed librarian in 1906. Her efforts, along with the support of the Garfields, led to the installation of electric lighting and more programs for children. The library was reorganized in 1926. The Menor Village School Board took over its operation, and the following year it was named Garfield Public Library in honor of the support given by the Garfield family.
He was very instrumental in a lot of good things that happened at Lake Erie College, too.
I didn't realize that he was president of the board for 40 years. Can you imagine that? God. His brother was president of Williams College for 25 years. Today, the average tenure of a college president is about 6 years. He lived until 1950. And so we saw a great deal of him. He was very much a part of our immediate family.
He used to love to see his kids and grandkids horsing around on the farm, because he was, like his father, very interested in Mother Earth. Yeah. He was a fun guy.
We had a tennis court, clay tennis court on the property, and my grandfather pretty murderous on where he could place the ball and you weren't. Those were sporty clothes at the time.
And he used to whip my butt on the tennis court when I was a young kid running around like a gazelle, and he was 82 years old. And I always got a big kick out of it.
He always wore this hat out in the country, and it was a wide brim brown felt hat, And he always carried a walking stick. I remember walking around the property with him and he'd tell me about the trees. There were 50-some different kinds of trees on this property here. And of course the loveliest of the trees were the elm trees, and the driveway going all the way from Mentor Avenue back up to Hollycroft was lined with elm trees. And when I was a kid, I'd ride my bike up through there and look up in the sky, and it was like a great Gothic cathedral.
We used to look forward to going up to Hollycroft, where he had a big sleeping porch in the northwest corner of the house. And he'd come out there and tell us some of the greatest stories you ever heard in your life. I mean, they were great stories. And friends of ours would come and spend the night just to listen to Bumps tell stories.
Told a wonderful story one. He was coming back on a train, which is the way you traveled in those days. And the train was held up by banditos from Mexico.
He went down there and practiced law to help people with problems that they couldn't afford without a lawyer.
One of the banditos had, in a skirmish, been shot in the leg. Doctor was a name of somebody who had more than a high school degree in many ways. And so the name on the compartment in the rail car said Dr. James Garfield. And so they came to the door, Doctor, come with us. And he said, I'm not a doctor. Doctor, se dice doctor. So he went out with him. Fortunately, he'd had a year of medical school before he decided he couldn't stand the sight of blood and didn't want to become a doctor. And they got him over to this guy who was groaning and in tough shape. And his solution was, I guess he got some brandy in the fellow. And enough so that he actually probed, he boiled a knife or something, probed, got the bullet out, got them all taped up, got in the train, they took off again. And ever after, he did not want doctor to appear anywhere near his name. As I thought back later, and I wasn't that conscious of it when I was a little kid, he was a man whose father was murdered when he was 15. And he was there. And he and one of his brothers, Uncle Hal, Harry. And obviously that had to have had an immense emotional impact for a whole lifetime. And to me, it also humanized somebody who was President of the United States, and to be able to say that was Bum's father. Not even as removed as my great-grandfather. So that put a sort of link between that generation and my generation.
Bob's father died in 1946, leaving him, his brother Pete, and their mother Eleanor. Real estate developer Ray Dawson remembers those early days with the Garfields.
I entered Mentor High School, 9th grade. And here comes all these kids from the village. And one of them sitting very close was a funny guy named Bob Garfield.
Ray was a great friend. He was a school friend of mine and a great friend of the family.
We immediately hit it off. And I consider us good friends ever since.
So you got to know his mom real well?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, the door was always open. I don't think they owned locks and keys.
I felt as if I brought Ray up. He really was my third son.
That's nice to hear.
She was some lady, huh?
Very much so. Too honest, too straight, but tough. And that's the way it should be.
In the early 50s, she was elected mayor of Mentor Village. Before her death in 1994, we met with Eleanor, and she talked about many of the events that took place in her lifetime.
How I got to be mayor was the most ridiculous thing in the world anyway.
How did she come to be the mayor of Mentor?
She got mad at the guys that were running the town.
And I was screaming because they hadn't done anything in the village. And why didn't they do this and why didn't they do that? And finally I said, if they don't, and I said to Bum was Mr. Garfield Sr., I said to Bum, if they don't do something in this town about these things, I'm going to run for mayor myself. And he said, well, my child, why don't you do it? And so I did.
There were two opponents. And she ran for office, and she got out and she saw people, and she talked to them, and she asked them what their concerns were and everything. She got twice the votes as the other two guys put together. And second time she was unopposed, and then she said, I'm smart enough to quit when I'm ahead, but not smart enough to be mayor any longer.
By now, Mentor was bursting at seams and continued to do so for the next 2 years. Many of the old settlers don't like this. They wanted to remain a quiet little country town, but I kept right on pounding away for better building codes, better planning commissions, better water, better roads. Then at the end of this term, I figured I'd better quit while I was still ahead. So I didn't run for a third term.
Bob's childhood home was in a house now located on Hollycroft Lane. At the time, though, it was still part of the Lawnfield property.
Well, there's a house up on what's called Hollycroft Lane now. That Hollycroft Lane didn't exist. We didn't call it Hollycroft, and we didn't call the other one Lawnfield. It was the old house, and there was a big house.
So that's where you grew up, essentially?
Yeah.
Until
Oh, yeah.
your dad passed away?
Right.
And I had to sell my house because Mr. Garfield had died.
But she had to move. And her attorney said, well, now, Eleanor, I think what you ought to do is to get an apartment somewhere. And she looked at him and made some rude comment. And she said, I'm not going to move to an apartment, no way. Ted Garfield, who was a cousin of my father's, son of Abram Garfield, the architect, communicated with other members of the family, and they agreed to sell the farmyard at almost a gift price to my mother. So she acquired, 6 acres or something like that. That included this barn, it included the granary, the corn crib, the chicken house, and then the tenant's house, which became the Little Red House. So she said, we're gonna make this place something to live in. And she didn't have any financial resources to count. And so it was all done with a sort of a wing and a prayer. And my brother and I worked on it, and we had an electrician who worked on it, and Ray Dawson's father built the chimney for it.
It was in the Little Red House that plans for Mentor's development were first made.
Well, they were going to run Route 2 in what she felt was a bad location because it killed off a lot of land which could have been used for industrial development.
I was determined it's going to go where I wanted it. Well, to put it next to the railroad tracks would have been a great mistake. We needed that space away from the railroad track.
She and Ray got talking about the thing and thought, it's ridiculous. Mentor's got to have some opportunity to fund the growth. You're going to have nothing but a bedroom community here and a lot of kids in school, and taxes will be outrageous and you won't be able to function. They got a hold of the illuminating company, and the illuminating company thought it was a wonderful idea.
We wanted to have an industrial park, and that's what we sold the CEI on. And I've got a plan someplace that I have in a book someplace of the original drawing that Ray Dawson and I made lying on our stomachs on my living room floor with a piece of wrapping paper and a pencil. And that's how we drew the industrial park.
So she pushed the buttons, and a trip was made to Columbus, Ohio. We walked in the governor's office with a few other folks, and I remember Frank Lauschy standing up and coming around the desk. Hello, Eleanor, how are you? Give her a big hug. And she immediately punched him with this big map we'd made. And said, this is our problem. Because he said, what could we do for you, And she showed him what was and what should be and what we thought. And she said, is that a big problem? He says, I don't think so. He pushes a button and in comes the director of transportation, highways or whatever they call it then. And they talked about it a bit, and he says, well, that's the way it's going to be. We'll redesign it and figure it out.
When Route 2 was finally completed in 1962, it made a shift to the north as it passed through Mentor, leaving the industrial corridor intact.
So that was the birth of the industrial park, which is now, Tyler Road Industrial Park. And there would have been nothing like that before.
Mentor grew up almost overnight.
I can remember when I used to give directions, don't wink or you'll miss the city.
35 years later, it's the largest city between Cleveland and Erie, Pennsylvania. It was fantastic, wasn't it?
I have never seen such an explosion in one little town in my life, but I still love it.
Well, I have this copy of a picture from Sunday, November 2nd, 1941, the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Young America wants to help, and here you are as a 10 or 12-year-old selling a soft drink.
That picture has my cousin Doug Garfield. Doug was Jimmy's brother, and Doug was a year older than me and almost like a brother to me. And my brother Pete, Borton Garfield, Pete. And so we set up a curbside Mentor Avenue soft drink business, and we got some sawhorses and planks and set up business out there. And you'll notice in that sign it says British War Relief. My mother made the sign, and one day one of her friends came in and said, "Eleanor, God, something's never changed. Look at the spelling. You've got British with 2 T's in it." She said, "What's wrong with that?" And I said, "Well, they just don't do it that way." And she said, "No, I'm not going to change it. Why would I change it? Everybody knows what it means anyway."
During World War II, your grandfather opened his home in Hollycroft to a number of English refugees.
Never forget that. My mother got a telegram. It was addressed to my grandfather. And she was a little perplexed when she got it. And it said, 2 mothers, 2 nannies, and 8 children arriving July 3rd or whatever it was. And it was, you know, like June 20th or 25th. He said, "Oh, didn't I mention that?" Well, and she said, "No." He said, "Well, a very dear friend who we knew back in Washington days and we've kept up with is English. And when the bombing came on and they started the evacuation of children, I cabled over and said, send as many of your grandchildren as you'd like for the evacuation." And this was a response. And they came and they were there for 4 years and they were family, really.
And of course, children has always been my downfall. I'd worship children. And we had all the room in the world.
And it brought life back into that old house. It was wonderful. But she had to scurry around and get things painted and hire people and get laundry services and everything. And because they were English children, she wanted to be sure there was a potty under each bed, even though there's plenty of bathrooms in the house.
Was this your mom then?
Yeah.
Your grandmother was also pretty civic-minded.
She was. She died in 1931 in an automobile accident. She was very hard of hearing.
Granny would walk around with a box about this size with batteries in it and a headset. And today, as you can see, you can't even see them. I hate them, but they're there.
She was the originator of what's now the Cleveland Hearing and Speech Center. At one time, it was named in her honor as Garfield House. And she worked with people, and they did lip reading then. They didn't do signing, or at least they didn't under the disciplines they were working with. But it made a big difference to a lot of people. That's a miniature oil of my grandmother, Helen Newell Garfield. And my grandfather always took that with him when he traveled.
It's beautiful. The house on Hollycroft was sold in the 1940s, and James R. spent his last years living with his younger brother, Abram, in Bracknell near Cleveland.
But Uncle Abe was a wonderful man, and they were great friends. I see those two having lunch together at the Union Club downtown, and it was a piece of history. But they were wonderfully human, fun, amusing.
Garfield died March 24, 1950, and is buried near his wife in Menor Cemetery.
I think one of the saddest days I've known other than my father's passing was when Bum died. It was a real shock to me because he was a wonderful man. I think one of his accomplishments, as far as I'm concerned, and I know that's pretty true for most of my family, was that he said, don't ever live on somebody else's laurels. You make your own, or don't live on somebody else's, because that'll get you nowhere. And it has proven true in a number of cases that I know of.
Today, James and Lucretia's legacy is carried on through their descendants. Tell us about the major project that you're working on right now.
Oh yeah. Biggest commitment right now is to a school for dyslexic children called the Lawrence School. And it's in Broadview Heights. And Jennifer has been on the board since it started 30 years ago. And we both, and she particularly, had a very major commitment to it because all three of our kids are dyslexic. And the objective is to have a youngster there for, 2 or 3 years, and hopefully through the kind of programs that they have, which are wonderfully effective, have them be able to cope and go back to their schools.
Jim Garfield visits Lawnfield often and has been a valuable resource in the restoration process.
I enjoy it, and they call me to go over and talk to kids, or sometimes they get me up early in the morning. They've got somebody that just has to see somebody that's related or lived in the house or something.
Jim is a great guy, a tremendous resource and help to us here at the site, and his ceaseless dedication to the property and our restoration effort has really been a marvel to behold. Please welcome President Garfield's great-grandson, Jim Garfield.
Probably here for the rededication a couple of years ago.
We had 100 of us from the family here.
Yeah, what were your impressions of that?
Marvelous. It was so depressing to see the old house sitting there looking tired like an old beach whale. And if you look at it now, it has the kind of colors on it I remember when I was a kid. And it just brings it to life because architecturally it's got an awful lot to offer. One of the remarkable things, of course, is that the high percentage of the contents of the house were original to the house when my great-grandmother lived there. Usually a family breaks up a house and everything goes, you know. And but it was sort of kept in suspended animation for a long time until it was turned over to the Historical Society. And my grandfather and his brothers and Aunt Molly didn't, they said, what are we going to do with this place? Even had talked about maybe tearing it down at one time. But they said, we don't want this to be a roadhouse. We don't want, how are we going to resolve this? Well, it was principally Lawrence Norton, I think, was the one who was the one with the greatest sight and was responsible for getting the Historical Society functioning, set up the Lake County Historical Society. You've got to maintain and encourage local commitment and involvement because that's where the soul of the property is going to be. I'm really thrilled to see it being taken care of and being loved.
Thank you all for coming and have a good visit. It's a great place.
Mentor's history continues to be preserved at the James A. Garfield site. The Park Service is finishing restoration of Eleanor Garfield's Little Red House, as well as other buildings on the property. Come visit a piece of living Mentor history. Information and tour times are available by calling the site at 255-8722.